My name is Michael Clark. I'm the director of the Portland Center for Public Humanities. It's a division of Portland State University, of course. And we fund and sponsor events of all sorts, all matters of public concern and basically concerns of human condition, both in the region and beyond it. I thank you all for coming tonight. This is an incredibly important panel, and we have to thank two people in addition to everyone else that's involved in this. Tracy Prince, who is one of our faculty fellows at the Humanities Center, and Van Pham, who is the woman at the mechanical devices in the back, videographing it, videotaping everything. We're going to have a question and answer period at the end of the event, so please hold your questions till then. Our guest speakers tonight live in Goose Hollow and Northwest Portland, two of the most densely populated neighborhoods in the entire state. They enjoy their walkable urban neighborhoods and are strong supporters of density and the urban growth boundary. If they're asking, what kind of city is Portland becoming? What kind of city does Portland want to become? These questions are being answered by Portland's new comprehensive plan and Central City 2035 plan, now under consideration by City Council. At a moment when Portland is facing the fastest rising housing prices in the nation and rapidly rising trends in gentrification, homelessness, and demolitions, many neighborhood residents say that they are being marginalized in the debate and are feeling increasingly frustrated and powerless by decision-making bodies that seem to no longer represent their interests. By contrast, Portland's planning leadership is promoting an exuberant confidence in their own vision of Portland as a Vancouver, BC-like city of very tall new buildings. They argue that adding housing units in tall buildings will bring down housing prices for everyone and will provide additional revenues with which to preserve historic buildings and then provide affordable housing. Our panelists argue that this is a questionable model, one that embraces supply-side economics and amounts to an unsound application of a trickle-down economic theory to urban policy, more aligned to the approach of Ed Glazer than Jane Jacobs. It was Jacobs who inspired Portland's progressive 1972 downtown plan and made possible so much of the progress Portland has made since then. That remarkable progress is now in jeopardy. From a planning and political leadership that fails to protect, much less build upon, Portland's great successes. The leadership, our panelists will argue, is underestimating the new realities of global real estate investing, the corrosive effect of money's influence and insider interests, and an unchallenged institutional consensus. Steve Pinger, a panelist. Steve Pinger, a Portland native and AEC consultant, has been involved in planning advocacy since the 1970s. He witnessed the adoption of the downtown plan in 1972 as an architectural student. He had a commercial architectural practice in Portland and Las Vegas, and he chaired the Pearl District Planning Committee and also serves on the Northwest District Association's Planning Committee. He has served on the advisory committees for the Pearl District Development Plan, Tanner Creek Parks, the Streetcar System Plan, Conway Redevelopment Task Force, the Conway Master Plans, and the CC 2035 West Quadrant Plan. Dr. Tracy Prince is our scholar in residence for the Portland Center for Public Humanities, as I said earlier. She's the author of 2 Portland history books and a book on multicultural issues in British literature. She's written many influential op-eds on Portland policies. One of her op-eds resulted in the Timbers Stadium including Chinese and Tanner Creek history, and another helped convince the naming committee to choose the Chinook jargon name for the Tilikum Bridge. A neighborhood activist for 10 years, she is the president of the Goose Hollow Neighborhood Association, has raised funds for Goose Hollow flags and sign caps, and is on the board of the Architectural Heritage Center. Dr. Michael Mahaffey is executive director of Portland-based Sustasis Foundation and an internationally active researcher and consultant in urban development. He has held teaching or research appointments at 6 universities in 5 countries, and he is on the editorial boards of 2 international research journals in urban design. He is also the author or contributing author of over 20 books, and an author for publications including the Atlantic City Lab, Urban Land, Metropolis, and Planetizen. He is currently a consultant to the United Nations for the upcoming Habitat 3 Conference on Global Urbanization. He's known to the Portland region for his work in implementation of sustainable mixed-use development, working with neighborhoods and stakeholders to find successful win-win strategies. He's also on the board of the Goose Hollow Neighborhood Association. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished panelists.
See if we can deal with some of the technical things first. Can we just lower the house lights a little bit? Point this in the right direction. That works. That works. Okay. I thought we'd start out with a quiz. I don't know how many of you are prepared here or not, but the first question is, where are we?
Probably Bridge.
Very good. Very good. Second question, and you can raise your hand on this one. Has Portland lost its way? So it hasn't. Nobody thinks Portland has lost its way, so we're going to do some work here. I don't know. I'm not going to try to answer that question, but I would like to try and present some things from my perspective that have come past me over the last couple of years. Has Portland lost its way? I don't know how that can be. I mean, it seems to me that everybody wants to move to Portland, and they are. So I don't know. Is Portland losing its way? And I suppose that's possible, but I don't know. What we do know is that Portland is updating its comprehensive plan. Kind of once in a generation activity that will have a significant influence on what sort of city Portland becomes over the next 30 years. As a portion of that updating of the comprehensive plan, the Central City Plan is also being updated, or the CC 2035 plan. I think I'll refer to it as the Central City Plan as often as possible. But the question, as it was framed just a moment ago, as these plans and the updating process goes forward, is will these plans build on Portland's great planning successes over the last 40 years? Or will Portland lose its way? So the West Quadrant Plan, or WQP, was adopted last year as one of the three quadrant plans. That would seem a little strange to me, but three quadrant plans. And that gives you the flavor of things to come here. Comprising the new Central City Plan, or CC 2035 plan. I was a member of the advisory committee for the West Quadrant Plan. From that experience, I would then like to talk in my segment here about tall buildings and the attendant building heights policy. I'm not an old-timey guy, and I'm not an anti-tall building guy. I, in my practice, was involved with many really tall buildings. But I would say as an understatement that I believe my views of the impacts of tall buildings evolved considerably during the West Quadrant Plan process. So that's what I would like to walk through. Tall buildings and building heights policy. So why is this important? why is building height policy important? Well, I would venture that no other factor has as great an influence on the livability of our city than our policy towards where and how many tall buildings can be built. And what are the impacts of tall buildings? Well, you know, tall buildings can offer some really great views, but I would suggest that they can be pretty rough on what it's like to be in the street and the sidewalks next to them. Technical adventure here, see if I can walk around with this. Now that's better. You know, what it's like to be here these days, as opposed to what it was like 10 years ago, is a really good question to ask. Tall buildings can create some pretty uncomfortable relationships with their shorter neighbors. You know, this building, ironically, was preserved by the building of that building, but I'm not sure that it's beyond that the most comfortable relationship in the world. A modest proposal for some of the properties in the northern end of downtown. Tall buildings can distort land values even without ever being built. All you need is the entitlements to do so. And tall buildings can make everything nearby unaffordable. And I think this is one of the real questions that Portland needs to address, because they are incentivizing affordable housing through essentially the building of taller buildings than were previously entitled. I would venture that the fallout of everything nearby becoming more affordable is that the smaller, newer businesses and companies engaged in the really dynamic economic experimentation and commercial experimentation that is really the lifeblood of future Portland is being threatened. So what I wanted to do is try and get to some of these questions through a bit of a structure here. I believe there are 5 myths about tall buildings that I would like to talk about, and then there are 3 plans that have all taken a different posture towards building heights policy that I would like to kind of run through quite quickly, but hopefully with some focus on how they have each looked at the distribution of building height. So first, the 5 myths. I'm trying to run through these fairly quickly. But I will say, as preface, all of these were from the testimony during the adoption of the West Quadrant Plan. These were statements that were made and are in the record. So myth number 1, greater height allows more design flexibility, lighter, more slender, airier buildings. I would say greater height doesn't allow more flexibility, it allows more height. Okay? And, you know, the design of a taller building may or may not be better for it being tall, but it will be taller, whatever it is. And I would just remind everybody, including myself, that poorly designed and constructed buildings are possible at any height, as are good ones. So myth number 2, kind of corollary to that, taller buildings require a more stringent construction type, which assures a better quality building. Well, I would say construction types are not necessarily a direct indicator of quality of the building, but they're a reliable indicator of the cost of the building. I think high-rise buildings cost more to build and occupy. It's just that simple. Poorly designed buildings are possible with any construction type, as are well-designed ones. Myth number 3, and this is a popular one. Oops. Oh, yeah, there we go. We need more height or we'll be sprawling to Forest Grove. Can't meet density goals without more height. Portland, for their run-up to the process that they are involved in right now, which started in 2008, 8 years ago, very clearly defined in their background studies that Portland does not need more height to compensate for any foreseeable shortage of development capacity. That the density goals as articulated by Metro can be met with the existing densities. Myth number 4. Try to go through this one fairly quickly, but it's a little engaged. Open space performance standards. There are, throughout Portland, a lot of areas that have been defined in the current plan as shade study areas, and they're typically adjacent to open space areas. And they are suggesting that you can build a taller building than would otherwise be allowed close to, say, the South Park blocks, if you can demonstrate that their shadows aren't any greater at certain times of the day on April 21st. Okay? I think kind of makes sense. This photograph here, unfortunately, it's not apparently one of those times of day that we seem to be concerned about, but the problem is shadows are not the whole story, I would venture. I think the real question about the protection of open space is that tall buildings tend to overwhelm adjacent open spaces. This building is 2 blocks away from here. There's another open space right next to it, Director's Park. I would also venture that the distinction between buildings as they are experienced on the sidewalk, on the street, in an adjacent open space. Once you get past a certain height, 150 feet, 175 feet, it really doesn't make much difference. You know, it can be 600 feet tall. Once it gets past a scale where you lose the human connection to the person in the top of that building. Now, mind you, there's a places for tall buildings. I'm not suggesting otherwise. But again, the adjacent to these open spaces, I don't believe is where is where they would be appropriate. In fact, I think it's kind of a ludicrous policy. My favorite, where are we now? This is not Portland, as we know. It's not Las Vegas. No, this is myth number 5. Even in Paris, there are buildings that are 689 feet tall, and that is absolute fact. 689 feet tall right there. And that was presented as a justification for building heights, the liberal building heights policy. The only hitch that I can tell is the Tour Montparnasse was completed in 1973. It's 240 feet taller than the second tallest building in Portland, and it is not well loved. In fact, I think most Parisians would prefer that it had never been built. So, those are the myths. And you know, my opinion is certainly throughout all of those, but I was interested that these were presented as fact at the testimony for the adoption of the West Quadrant. 3 plans. So, plan number 1 is 1972, the downtown plan, which I consider the fundamental planning document in Portland. It has as much relevance today as it did then, although there were some things that it missed. I don't think that we really anticipated what would be happening up here. And I'm not sure that devoting areas like this to parking, structured parking, were the best idea, but that wasn't explicitly what it said. What it was quite clear about, though, was an attitude, an approach, a conception of the urban design of Portland. And to look at it diagrammatically, the dark area there is what would be considered the high-density, tall, high height allowance area, with buildings probably allowed up to around 40 stories. Strong retail core, adjacent medium density office and housing areas that would then step down to the river, which was the other key piece. So concentrate density along the north-south transit spine between 4th Avenue and Broadway. Step down the building heights to the river and to the western neighborhoods and protect the park block. Fundamentally, those were the things that it was saying were the basic, important, fundamental elements of the plan going forward. I would ask you to just kind of keep an eye on this stretch here. Density and height should be concentrated along the transit spine between 4th and Broadway, okay? This is the missing link in Portland planning. This is the maximum heights map that existed all the way till 1988, when the next generation plan, the Central City Plan, was done. So this presumably represented the implementation, or lack of implementation, I would suggest, of the downtown plan when it came to the ordinance. What it shows is a 460-foot allowable building height in all the area in dark brown, including Kings Heights, or Kings Hill here, all the way through Goose Hollow, all of the South Auditorium area, and what is now part of the Zidell Yards. Again, this was in place until 1988. So there's a significant contrast between the transit spine, which would be right about here, and what was on the books. Lower density. So those are, 30 and 20-story buildings respectively, and 10 to 12-story buildings, okay? So then plan number 2, 1988 Central City Plan. There again is your tall building area. Broadway is there. 4th is there. So it's still in areas much beyond what had been proposed and adopted as policy. 40-story buildings, 30-story buildings, 20-story buildings, 10-story buildings. Reduced a lot of the allowable height, but retained the 460-foot height into the west end. And it also provided a housing bonus that allowed for 75 feet of additional height in almost any area. All of the hatched areas that you see here. So that's 100 feet, but it's really 175 feet, okay? Needless to say, that housing bonus has been immensely successful in the intervening years. So plan number 3, 2016. This is what's going through the adoption process right now. This is what came out of the West Quadrant plan. And it proposes 460 feet, kind of tall buildings. Again, here's Broadway, here's 4th, so we still have a lot of height in areas that the downtown plan didn't imagine. And we now have unlimited height in this area. 30-story buildings, 20-story buildings, 10-story buildings. Okay? Increased the heights in most of the Pearl District. Okay? Extended the 460-foot height along the transit road, which if anywhere, that's probably an appropriate place to do that. But it also increased the heights at the bridgeheads here and here. This little strip right here went from a 75-foot height to a 230-foot height. And that makes a difference, not only in economically, but in what it means to step down to the river, because now we're stepping down and stepping back up again. I would also suggest that that change in height, if I had a building here that I thought had a protected view to the river, I would be upset about that height. I would question its legality, frankly. And the justification, particularly here, for that increase in height was that it was intended to help to activate the waterfront park. I mean, I think that development along Front Avenue is necessary. I'm not sure that that's going to get you the activation of the waterfront park. I think buildings in Waterfront Park would probably activate Waterfront Park, but politically, I don't think that's going to get very far. But it needs private frontages at the park. So here, building heights. These are the areas in which building heights have been increased or proposed to be increased. But it also, this diagram includes an area where they're actually being reduced. All right? Some of the increases are moderate. You know, the increases here are fairly significant. These are kind of big deals. This will make a big difference, going from 175 feet to 250 feet. I mean, they're still not hugely tall buildings, but percentage-wise, that makes a big difference in the way the economics of the buildings work. So I fear for South Pearl. But the amazing thing is that it proposed quite a bit, an extensive amount of additional height, but with no increase in density. I have had listened to a number of people in positions in which they have a great deal of influence and authority say that we need to increase height in the central city to be able to achieve our density goals. And I think the great irony of the plan that is going through, the CC 2035 plan as it's going through right now, is that it does not increase density. It simply increases height. And that is a completely different formula. And that is licensing tall real estate with the hope that that tall real estate will then shower benefits to the rest of the city. So watch very closely. One of the areas here, the old post office. Yep. So that's where the increase in density went, to the slide that was essentially the cover shot. Okay, so the West Quadrant plan is now being transcribed into code language, into ordinance. And it's following on these general, with respect to heights and densities and views, with these general objectives. Retain the building height pattern from the 70s, but allow taller buildings along Transit Mall. Okay, well. Retain the basic step down to the Willamette River, parks and adjacent neighborhoods could allow greater height around the bridge heads. Well, both of these would make a lot more sense to me if the downtown plan had actually been implemented 40 years ago, even 30 years ago. Protect public view corridors based on the draft Central City Scenic Resources Plan. And I think there are abundant issues about what is being proposed there. And establish height limits and new regulations within historic districts to ensure compatibility with existing historic character. Okay. That is getting translated into Policy 5.3, dynamic skyline. That's an interesting phrase to use for heights policy. Okay, going to step down, going to be contextually sensitive at the bridges and within the historic districts. And we're going to preserve sunlight. Okay. All of these, I mean, I think are getting in the right direction, but fall pretty well short. It's not about, for example, preserving sunlight. That's not the whole story. It's preserve the open space and preserve the integrity and what it feels like to be in that open space. So, my view, and I guess if I'm trying to answer the question, has Portland lost its way? I would say yes. Too much height in too many places. Okay. Open space standards don't protect open space. Affordable housing bonus is unproven and relies on mechanisms that I'm pretty sure will make everything else more unaffordable. The proposed allowable building heights and other incentives will create economic pressures that I fear threaten the iconic buildings and places that make Portland, Portland. So, everybody wants to come live and work in Portland, and I'm pretty sure it's not because of Portland's exciting skyline. But there are those that would have me think that. But I think they come here because of its comfortable scale, the character of its streets and neighborhoods, and its unpretentious buildings and way of life. So at heart, the CC 2035 plan is about what kind of city we want Portland to become over the next generation. How we manage the height of buildings, the height that buildings are allowed to be built to, and where they can be built is a fundamental part of this question, and no other factor has the ability to influence the livability of the central city to the extent that this does. And Portland's livability is its greatest asset.
All right, I'm going to do what Steve did and move out to the side here. Just to follow up with what Steve talked about, in my view, when you increase the heights dramatically at the riverfront, then you are making those views and the protected glorious views of the river and Mount Hood, etc., available only to the wealthiest. And so it is making that a privatized asset that I believe is our civic asset. So I've been one of the many people contributing to the propaganda that Portland is the most amazing city, and it's because of our good urban planning that got us here. I used to teach in the Urban Studies and Planning department, and I contributed to this book, which many of our colleagues in the department contributed to, because we had so many people coming to Portland and saying, how'd you do it? I'm here because I love Portland. I've lived in a lot of different places, and this is the place I want to put my feet down, and I've been here since 2001. There's a, goodness, this is cutting off, so let's see. We'll just have to see how this goes. Okay, so there's a whole storyline about the great urban planning that got us here. and the civic involvement that had people doing protest picnics on the Harbor Freeway in order to show that the citizens did not have access to the water. That freeway was torn out because of that citizen activism, and we now have the waterfront park as a result of those wonderful citizens who did that for us. They also stopped the Mount Hood Freeway. We have a great history of neighborhood involvement and citizen activism. And I'm going to try to show you how you can influence this process. So is there any way we could do can you fiddle with the aspect ratio, Van? I'm so sorry. So welcome to reality. The reality is a little different than the propaganda. If you were as involved and in the weeds in these issues as the three people speaking today, you might be aware of it, but most people don't have the time for that or don't really know what's happening in their name in this city. So I'm going to be talking about the diminishment of the neighborhood associations, violations of state land use laws, huge ethics problems, and a sycophantic emulation of the Vancouver model. I'm going to blaze, so you're going to have to watch the video later to get it all in there. So the neighborhood associations have been made practically irrelevant in the 2035 comp plan. This gives lobbyists unfettered access to public officials. How does it do that? Well, under city and state laws, neighborhood associations, which all three of us are heavily involved in, must have open meetings, publicly accessible records, democratic elections, and a conflict of interest policy. So that when we arrive at City Council, there's some assurance that we're speaking on behalf of the residents and the businesses in our neighborhood association. In the 2035 comp plan, business associations and recognized organizations are elevated to equal importance as neighborhood associations, yet are not required to adhere to any of these laws. So this creates a problematic situation that we have certainly seen in my neighborhood in Goose Hollow, where we, the residents, voted out the people that we thought were voting in their own financial interest, who are the developer class. And we've had resounding neighborhood votes since then, huge rooms full of people who keep voting us back in because we're doing what the residents want us to do. That class of people who were formally convincing the city that they were speaking on behalf of the residents, but they were actually trying to make sure the policies gave them the most profit, then formed another business association, which the Northwest Examiner has looked at, and they can't find any, just a handful of people who will claim publicly that they're part of it. Most of those people are conflicted financially and stand to gain financially from the process. So the City Council has no way of knowing that they're interacting with basically a lobbyist. And we want protections, and we believe that the bright light of day and democracy of neighborhood associations provide that. In Comp Plan's Chapter 2, called Community Involvement, it spends more time making sure that the rights of property owners who don't live in Portland are protected than protecting the rights of residents in neighborhood associations. This is the policy at the bottom, and this is a fundamental change from the past, where residents are not considered stakeholders. It is a big, big problem in Portland today. Residents are marginalized, are unimportant, and the people who have something financially at stake are the ones who get heard more. We have certainly seen that in Goose Hollow. This is a cartoon from the Northwest Examiner. If you don't read it, you need to. Every issue teaches us something. We've learned a lot about ethics and good governance from the incredible research done by the Northwest Examiner. So they're mixing up the dyslexia of privileges. Instead of seeing good citizens are the riches of the city, they say, good heavens, Gladys, wealthy citizens get good and rich off the city. We neighborhood associations share stories with each other about planning bureau leadership, and I'm not talking about the middle and the lower ranking staff members, I'm talking about the leadership who treat neighbors as annoying NIMBYs while giving developers privileged access to positions on stakeholder advisory committees and access to set policy. This is how your city is being planned right now. So, for example, Susan Anderson tried to recruit an architect in our neighborhood that I think she thinks will vote her way to go sit on our board. This is unethical, that my planning bureau is trying to stack my neighborhood association, and I have a big problem with that. So, violations of state land use laws. I'm just trying to tee this up for anybody who wants to sue them. The goal number 1, citizen involvement. The citizen involvement program shall involve a cross-section of affected citizens in all phases of the planning process. Well, if you've been reading your Northwest Examiner faithfully, you would know that 72% of West Quadrant SAC members stood to gain, Stakeholder Advisory Committee members stood to gain financially, directly or indirectly from the policies they were voting on for height limits and zoning, etc. There was only one West Quadrant resident on the SAC. Melvin Mark, a major development company, had 2 representatives on the SAC, so they were better represented than the residents of Portland were represented. Several SAC members didn't even live in Portland, but they set policy for Portland's future. So the people who lived outside of the city had better access to setting the policy than the residents who live in the West Quadrant area. It's a big problem when you're not considered a stakeholder. Another section of the state law requires that technical information assures that technical information is available in an understandable form. The information necessary to reach policy decisions shall be available in a simplified, understandable form. Assistance shall be provided to interpret and effectively use technical information. This is only a small portion of what I've been reading in my free time for the last 2 years. I want you to raise your hand if you've read even half of what I have listed up there. Raise your hand. This is how your citizen participation is playing out in real life. When you have over 1,000 pages to read, and this is just in this draft of the document, then I do not believe that that is adhering to state land use laws. I believe that there are huge ethical problems that has also been revealed in the Northwest Examiner. The current way of doing business in Portland is full of graft. We've earned an F rating from the Center for Public Integrity because of this. And I'll just deal with the graft that is apparent in the current comp plan and Central City 2035 plan process. On the West Quadrant SAC, 24 of 33 members, or 72%, were owners of multiple properties in the area being voted on, or were developers, architects, and others with a financial stake in the process. Egregious offenders are on record advocating for increased heights and relaxed zoning on their own or their company's properties. They were not asked to disclose their financial interest. PBOT, Central City Parking Stakeholder Advisory Committee, which was part of the transportation system plan that they had to make decisions to guide the staff members, included 3 owners of most of the parking spaces in downtown Portland. This SAC was asked to vote on whether or not Portland should incentivize the building of new parking structures. So they're literally being asked, should the city give me more money? I'm not joking. This is how business is done in Portland. So in the Northwest Examiner, we learned about an anonymous group of citizens who filed a complaint about these processes, and the ombudsman who made a statement that, yes, some ethical problems existed. Alan Clausen in the Northwest Examiner, as the editor, he wrote, "This means West Quadrant SAC members could have attended meetings wearing t-shirts imprinted, 'Support unlimited zoning on Block 49, which I own,' without triggering an actual conflict. They couldn't run afoul of such a loose standard had they tried." And I love the cartoon of them throwing the ethics overboard so that they can get more height. This is the Ombudsman's report, which said the Planning Bureau and the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability did not ensure compliance with the state conflict of interest law when it convened a series of stakeholder advisory committees to make land use and urban planning recommendations. State law required that committee members timely and publicly disclose if they could gain, I think, financially benefit from their recommendation. So to this day, it was a very bizarre retroactive disclosure because they'd already promoted their own financial interest in the stakeholder advisory committee meetings, but they were asked to disclose retroactively. And several of the members of that group have refused to disclose their financial interest. What has this meant for the members? And this is what the heights were before and after. Because I have to get moving for sake of time, you can just take a look through there of what serving on a stakeholder advisory committee will get you. The Multnomah County sold 4 prime downtown blocks to Melvin Mark Development Company for the Morrison Bridgehead project, and Portland City Council is prepared to raise the maximum building height from 75 to 235 feet, reversing established policy of stepping heights downward toward the river. And these are just a similar graphic that appeared in the Northwest Examiner showing that 75-foot height limits would be increased to 235. We were shocked to see a draft of the Central City 2035 plan which took away the protected view corridor to and from the Vista Bridge. That, are we out? Hello? So the Vista Bridge currently has protections protecting the view to the bridge and from the bridge. And that we were shocked to find that the most recent draft of the Central City 2035 plan increased heights from 45 feet to 130 feet, and which would, as you can see in the mock-up here, would block half of the view of the bridge. This was a caricature done in the May edition of the Northwest Examiner of one of the owners of that property, who is also represented Melvin Mark issues. So the planning staff have heard a resounding response from the residents who sent in, I think there were probably 45 letters sent in and a lot of letters to the editor, and the residents are very firmly against this, obviously. So I look forward to seeing the next draft of the plan to see if the residents have been listened to instead of the one developer who stands to gain financially. This is what deregulated heights will give you. Deregulated heights that benefit the developers, and as Steve talked about in his presentation, have little benefit to the residents. This is a massing study from the Vista Bridge, where you can see Mount Hood. These are the heights that are currently allowed today. And these are the heights that, just from the Vista Bridge, this is just that little snippet of downtown of how that would change. And this deregulation of height and zoning is a developer giveaway. State ethics laws must be strengthened. City and state laws currently have a lax interpretation of what a financial conflict is, and it allows public officials to continue to vote on issues where they stand to gain financially. We have to lock this down. I've been talking to every politician who will listen to me. I hope you will talk to your politicians. We need this handled at the state level. We need a change in our state ethics laws. No one anywhere in Oregon should be voting on any issue where they could gain financially. That's called graft in most of America. But that's how we do business on a daily basis in Portland and throughout the state. And I'm not blaming the current staff members. They're doing what has always been done, and that's why we need to change the law. So let's look at the sycophantic emulation of the Vancouver model. So I lived in Vancouver for 3 years when I taught at the University of British Columbia. I lived right there in the 9th floor of a 10-story building in the East End, or the West End, sorry, near English Bay. Vancouver has just been named the 3rd least affordable city by Demographia in 2016. This was an article that ran in the Globe and Mail. Vancouver is mortgaging its future for a market that's anything but free. Here's some quotes from the story. One pernicious lie has snaked its way into popular discourse, that this is simply free market capitalism at play. The immigrant investor program, through this scheme, 45,000 millionaires migrated to Vancouver between 2005 and 2012 alone, and we have that same program in America. It just costs a little more to buy your way in. Vancouver is the Wild West. Developers hold disproportionate political influence. Sound familiar, Portland? The irrational exuberance of Vancouver, BC's urban planners, privileging foreign investors and developers over average residents. This led to skyrocketing housing costs. Portland planners are falling over themselves to emulate Vancouver. This is where that urban planning strategy leads. And my last slide is from the Vancouver Sun. It has become a very big political issue in Vancouver because I go back 2 or 3 times a year, since I have friends who are raising kids right along with me, and it's one of my many hometowns. That I followed the political process where people are having to make promises as they run for political offices to say, we're going to do something about these empty condos. Because the condos are used as savings deposit boxes in the sky for people who are in unstable economies, or they just make more money on the real estate return than they would in their own country. And that leaves 12.5% of these condos vacant, which accounts for most of the city's 10,800 empty homes. And so they're talking about doing a punitive tax measure against owners of vacant properties, and London has a similar problem with these vacancies at 13.5%, if you've read about that in The Guardian or the New York Times or other places. So those are, I know I'm just flying by these issues, but we're trying to get a lot of issues out so we can discuss them later. So I'll hand the next off to Michael.
Thank you, Tracy. Let me switch over here. So I'm going to broaden the discussion a little bit and bring up a little bit of academic issue, hopefully not too much of an academic issue. Let me see here. How do I do this? There we go. Okay, so what I'd like to do is talk about the particular fork in the road that we're facing from a philosophical point of view. You've heard Steve and Tracy talk in detail about what the specific issues are with tall buildings and with the public process that's led to some of the planning decisions that have been made. And I'd like to step back a little bit and look at the philosophical positions of, is that working okay? Of how we are thinking about our planning in our city, what direction that we're going. And I'm framing this, as you see, as a choice between a kind of Jane Jacobs model, if you will, and a model better represented by the economist Edward Glaeser, who was just here actually a couple of weeks ago. And I'll explain a little bit more about what I mean by that. Jacobs is the model that I think it's fair to say has been Portland's guide star philosophically up till now, ever since the 1970s, and through the development of lots of the things that we now recognize as successes. And I suspect that many of you are already familiar with Jane Jacobs' work. If you're not, I encourage you to seek it out. It's really a marvel of lucid thinking and insight. For example, her first great book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, describes a number of qualities that we have sought and largely gotten here in Portland and preserved that we inherited. A mix of uses, a diversity of building types and ages with a good mix of heritage with the new, the preservation of relatively small blocks and fine-grained pedestrian networks, and the kind of urban compactness that supports walkability and sidewalk life at a kind of fine-grained human scale. All of these and others are what she calls generators of diversity, and urban diversity is a good thing, both socially and economically, and she explains that in great detail in the book. But more than that, Jacobs is a model of a diverse and complex kind of network city with lots of distributed agents doing lots of different things spread out across different scales of urban space and time, a kind of fine-grained distribution. And there are some strong echoes there in modern complexity science, if those of you who know a little bit about that, the science of complex adaptive systems. And this is a fascinating and important point, I think. And actually her last chapter in Death and Life talks about that a little bit. So the other model that I'm pitting Jacobs against is not the usual one that you may have heard about, her great historical nemesis, Robert Moses. But Robert Moses was that freeway builder who did play an outsized role in Portland's planning history and in many other places around the country with the freeway plans and other sort of modernist urban planning ideas that most of us now do reject. But instead, I want to characterize the model that has risen to prominence and that's now really the path we're on, as I said, as the Edward Glaeser model, the particular model of urban economic development that I think the city planning department is now set on. And Glaeser is a Harvard economist who wrote the book that you see here, The Triumph of the City, and he's noted for celebrating the economic power of, if you will, cities on steroids. Now, in some respects, though, Glaeser is supportive of Jacobs' urban economics, notably on the creative capacity of cities, on the value of concentration and a kind of critical mass of economic interaction, and the importance of what are called knowledge spillovers, where people exchange information and creative ideas, and that accounts for the economic dynamism of cities. In fact, sometimes these spillovers are called Jacobs spillovers in honor of Jane Jacobs' contributions to the field. Lots of interesting research going on that now. But in other respects, Glaeser is profoundly antagonistic to Jacobs' vision, and in that conflict, I think we have something important to learn about our current situation here in Portland and our current choice for the future. So I'd like to try to describe that conflict a little bit more, and maybe we can discuss that if we have time. One of these issues has to do with the benefits of density or compactness, and up to a point, Glaeser agrees with Jacobs that at some level, this is certainly beneficial economically and in many other ways. A low-density sprawl is detrimental to the creativity and the resource efficiency of cities. Both of them agree on that. But Jacobs is also very careful to note that it's not just compactness, but other factors of urban form that generate diversity. Again, small blocks, diversity in building types, and all the other things I mentioned before. As we can say, we can easily see, for example, here in San Francisco, it's important to note, and I'll come back to this point, that San Francisco is now a fantastically expensive gentrified city, but the urban form can exist whether or not a city is gentrified or not, and the urban form here is very important and beneficial. More to the point, whereas going from low to moderately high density can be associated with many beneficial effects, it does not necessarily follow that increasing from moderately high to very high will also be beneficial. This example of San Francisco shows a very successful density in terms of many of the benefits of resource efficiency and social interaction and so on, and it's moderately high, not very, very high. No tall buildings, of course. But as is the case with a lot of phenomena, increasing up to a point may be beneficial, whereas increasing beyond that point may bring diminishing benefits or even negative consequences, and that's certainly true for urban density. Let me give you an example just to illustrate this point and hopefully get our heads around it because it is a bit abstract. If I take one aspirin and it has a certain positive effect, then I can take 2 aspirins and that will have twice as beneficial an effect, right? That's very obvious. Increasing quantity has a corresponding increase in benefits. But what if I said, well, how about if I take 100 aspirin? Is that going to give me 100 times more benefit? No, of course not. In fact, the effect will not only not be beneficial, it will be toxic, and I'm probably going to have to have my stomach pumped. And as Jacobs points out, many phenomena are like this. Many phenomena in biological systems, but also in urban systems, and density is one of these. Too much of a good thing can be bad. Too much density can be bad. I'm going to speak in a little more detail later about the phenomenon of gentrification, which Jacobs also describes in similar terms. Some gentrification can be good, too much can be bad. But right now, let me just focus on the simple idea that increasing density is automatically good for sustainability. Like a lot of simple ideas, it can be a simplistic one. And I think you can already see that things might not work out that way. Here's an example of some of the research that I've become acquainted with during my dissertation on climate change and urban form. And as you can see, there's a kind of a hockey stick pattern as you go up from low to high. You get low to medium, you get a pretty dramatic effect, and then as you go from medium to high, it tapers off. Same thing here. This is building energies, transportation energy, and you can see the same pattern in a lot of these. What you see is that there's this kind of a sweet spot of about 50 to 100 people per acre, maybe 20 units per acre, so about what Northwest Portland is today. If we could get Portland as a whole to go from the current 5 units per acre overall, which is quite low even by US standards, to something more like 20 units per acre, that would be very helpful, and we should bear that in mind. But if we try to concentrate much higher densities in certain areas like the central core, this indicates that we would not gain much benefit, and we might even generate many negatives. It seems clear that as you go above this sort of optimum level, the positive effects diminish and negative effects begin to kick in. People are already walking a lot when you get up to the medium densities, and they're not going to keep walking more. They've already shifted most of their trips to walking, and you begin to get other negative effects, like things like the embodied energy in tall buildings that require lots more steel and concrete and so on. So there are lots of negatives that kick in and offset any additional benefit. And this brings me to a related claim. Steve touched on this earlier, the idea that taller buildings are somehow inherently more sustainable because they can accommodate green technologies or more sophisticated building systems and so on. This is something that my colleague Nikos Salingaros and I took on in the book that we wrote together, Design for a Living Planet, and in this particular chapter, Why Green Often Isn't. We really unpacked these claims and evaluated them. Many of them have been wildly exaggerated claims that have been disproven by abundant research. And that photo, by the way, is of the Anara Tower in Dubai, which is a canceled project that featured an entirely fake wind turbine in it. And the building is facing to the western sun in Dubai, if you can imagine a less sustainable building than that, I dare you. So again, this is the greenwashing that I think we have to be very wary of. And I speak as a member of the design professions that all of us need to be careful about. Not only the deliberate and sneaky kind, but also the subtle and self-deluding and self-rationalizing kind. And the kind that I and my colleagues allow ourselves to indulge in a little too often, let's be honest about it. I think it's critical that we put ourselves on a more solid, evidence-based footing to know what the research really says about tall buildings and about other things that we deal with and that we recommend to our clients and to the public, and other claims about the latest novelties in architecture and urban planning. And I'll leave that for another discussion because it's a big topic too. I have, however, done a number of survey research efforts on these and related matters. Our foundation is really dedicated to trying to make everyone more aware of these issues, including ourselves. And the material really is not that hard to find. You can see the link up above there if you want to go on our website and look at this white paper. And I'm just going to briefly summarize. I'm not going to go into any detail on this, but suffice it to say there is abundant research evidence about the many negative factors with tall buildings and with other similar claims that Steve and Tracy touched on also. Here are some of the research citations that give rebuttals, strong rebuttals to the claims. Here's another very interesting set of research findings about how we in the design professions literally see the world differently than 99% of the rest of the world, the public, the people who actually need to decide and have a say, presumably, in the democratic process. So these are important issues. Here's a one-page briefing that sort of abstracts those that you can also find on the website. Here's a very interesting illustration. You would think that the U.S. Bancorp building, which is 42 stories, would have much greater density and more floor area ratio than the Meyer and Frank building, which is only 14 stories. But if you actually crunch the numbers, as I've done here, you find surprisingly that they're exactly the same, almost exactly the same. We need to verify this, but this is pretty clearly a rebuttal of the idea that height, whoops, is this dead now?
No, you have it.
It's not. That's not.
Is it working?
It's this
Okay.
loudspeaker that cuts out, that one's on.
What's that? Okay, let's see. Yeah, it's coming and going for some reason. I think the battery's going dead on it. At any rate, yeah, could we get maybe the other one, the battery in the other one in just a moment? I think this one is fine now. At any rate, okay. So this is an illustration of the point that, as Steve was saying, taller buildings are not necessarily a panacea when it comes to getting increased numbers of units. There are lots of ways to sort of organize building form to get equivalent amounts of square footage. And when you have to set back, as you do with tall buildings, for a number of reasons, that really limits what you can get out of them. So again, I'm just arguing here for a much more evidence-based footing for us in the design professions, for the people who are at the city, and to have a more sort of rational discussion about these issues. Okay, so let me get back to what I call the Jacobs model, contrasting that with the Ed Glazer model, and how that can be a useful contrast. Now, Glazer has also completely rejected a core part of Jacobs' insights, or perhaps he simply hasn't understood it, and that has to do with the dynamics of gentrification. I touched on this a moment ago. Glazer maintains that Jacobs was wrong to want to keep all those sort of cute old buildings in Greenwich Village for the sake of a diversity of building ages and types, and that just created horrible gentrification and so on. And instead, what we should be doing, like any good classical economist, is providing more supply to meet demand. Build up those buildings, add units, conserve farmland, reduce sprawl, and that's how you're going to control housing prices. You're going to add supply to meet demand. And then you'll also get more money out of that process, so you'll have a sort of trickle-down phenomenon and get money for new public spaces and preservation of some of the historic buildings, and you'll get to do some affordable housing and so on and so forth. But I think it's essential that we understand, we examine these kinds of claims for their logical soundness. First of all, are we ever going to get prices to go lower than the cost of the new housing that we create? No, of course not, because the builders of those houses are going to have to get a profit for those, and that means it's going to have to be considerably higher than the cost to construct them. And tall buildings are one of the most expensive forms of construction that one can have. And you can see the results of this strategy, as Tracy was saying, in a place like Vancouver, where the prices have not come down, and in fact, many of the units sit empty, as she alluded to. The idea of safe deposit boxes in the sky, and it has become a kind of runaway process. And this is something that in Vancouver, as Tracy alluded to, people are seeing real estate as a great safe haven, and that's particularly true in the United States, and it's particularly true in our coastal cities. So watch out, Portland. But the second issue is, how much of the problem are we actually dealing with in the core? Admittedly, that's low-hanging fruit. It's easier to do these expensive development deals there and so on. But we have a region of 2.3 million people. So what percentage are we talking about in the core, the roughly 5% of the area? Well, we have a little over 6,000 people living in the Pearl District right now that we've gotten over about the last 20 years. And that's less than 0.3% of the current regional population. And that suggests the kind of magnitude that we're talking about here. But for that small gain, we're talking about making a big impact on the urban character of the core, as Steve was alluding to earlier. We're going to incentivize development, which is the entire rationale for raising the height. And that means we're going to incentivize demolition of historic structures. We're going to impact shading, wind, view, and other effects on our vital public realm. And we're going to impact the aesthetic experience within the public realm and profoundly shift the character from a proven success to a series of one-off designer novelties with profound impacts on the long-term character of the city. I think we should really think very carefully about that, about the direction that we're going in terms of the aesthetics and the other qualities. Are we actually having an effect on the overall housing prices of the region and the problem of gentrification in the core? Once again, you can see from the examples of Vancouver and other vertical cities that it's simply too often not possible to build one's way out of an affordability crisis. Again, some other dynamic has to be recognized and taken into account beyond sheer quantity. It's a little like building our way out of freeway congestion by simply adding lanes. Even if we're able to add significant capacity, and even that's in doubt here, as I just pointed out, even if we could, though, the result always seems to induce even more demand, and the problem continues and even accelerates. As for going more vertical in the core, not only is that a small drop in the bucket, it's at the wrong end of the price scale, too, as Steve and Tracy alluded to. It makes the Portland core more attractive to wealthy buyers, which can have the perverse effect of raising the prices of existing properties. And I know that's counterintuitive, but there is research on this. It's well documented. Again, the Vancouver experience ought to give us pause. I think the lesson is that real estate is not some interchangeable commodity that simply behaves according to laws of supply and demand. It matters a lot where real estate is. Location, 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 right? So let me also suggest that the Glazerite attack on Jacobs for advocating the preservation of a mix of building types and ages is also quite misinformed. Jacobs' approach did not result in excessive gentrification when it was understood to be accurate as what she described, because it did not assume, as Glazer does, that we keep focused on one spot on the core and what I will call hypertrophy in place. Instead, Jacobs was all about diversity in geography as well as building type, about spreading out and having a more polycentric kind of development pattern. And Jacobs did point out a wonderful passage in Death and Life that gentrification is not always a bad thing. It can be positive if it has the effect of increasing diversity and increasing opportunity if you're going from a slum to a more mixed kind of income place, what she called unslumming. But at a certain point, that gentrification can become toxic. Remember the aspirin example I gave you before. And it can create a monoculture of the wealthy. You can lose diversity. You can create other problems, as we're seeing in many of these cities, including Portland. You can put a Band-Aid on that by providing subsidized affordable housing, but again, it's a Band-Aid on what's likely to be a runaway process, precisely because by not limiting the process, you have allowed it to run away. This is what government really needs to do. So what Jacobs advises is to move to other sites and make them more diverse, more mixed, more lively places too. Places for everybody, including families. In New York, she said, ease up on the hypertrophy in place in Manhattan. After all, you've got Queens, the Bronx, Staten Island, many other places. Bring in some gentle densification in those places, some well-designed contextual infill that adds more units across a larger area. You can't say that we don't have great urban fabric to work with all over this country that's just crying out for this good kind of gentrification in places like Detroit, Cleveland, New Orleans, and so many other cities that would benefit from that kind of growth. But, Jacob said, we need to understand what economically healthy, sustainable cities really are and how they work, what she called the kind of problem a city is. And in Portland, too, we also have lots of places that are crying out for more attention more resources, more economic opportunity and liveliness. I'll only mention, I'm sure many of you know, Gateway, Lentz, Southeast 122nd, and so many others. And regionally, there are the inner tier suburbs like Beaverton and Gresham, Oregon City, and so on. And we're losing sight of those. We haven't focused enough on those places, I don't think. Although there has been some attention, but where we focused on them, I think we've made some pretty serious mistakes. What I call field of dreams planning. Plan it and they will come. And that doesn't work. I'm afraid there's not enough focus on the tools that this job is really going to require, the tools really needed to pull this off. And yet, as Jane Jacobs argued, there are tools and methods that can be used in these places. And that's what personally interests me and what I have tried in my own way and through our small NGO to contribute in a positive direction for the region. So I think, once again, to echo what Steve and Tracy have both said, Jane Jacobs points us in the right direction, and Edward Glaser points us in a dangerous direction, as the evidence suggests. One that I think we need to recognize, we need to debate, and we really need to ask ourselves if it serves this magnificent heritage we have in this city. And I mean not only the fine old buildings, but the heritage of planning from 1972 and beyond. Or are we destroying that heritage? Thank you. I just want to note, this is also on the web today is a companion article. It's on planetizen.com, planetizen.com. Questions?
Not really a question, but just a check-in. I wonder if we have any representatives of our city council and elected officials.
Planning commissioner right here.
They were invited, and this will be videotaped, and we will be sending them copies, or a link to the videotape.
I think that's telling.
Good point. I'll motion.
Howdy, I was wondering, has anyone considered perhaps the idea of growth in surrounding areas in other metro locations such as Oregon City, Gresham, Hillsborough? I'm always wondering, the dialogue seems to start, if we're going to make room for 200,000 extra people by the year 2050, and I'm thinking, wait a minute, what if we don't make room for 200,000 people?
Move to Russia.
What will happen is the prices will go up, okay? Home prices will go up. Yes, they will. There has not been a city, successful city, where prices have not gone up, despite rent controls, affordable housing, any manipulation that one can place on the city structure. So the prices are going to go up anyway. And in the meanwhile, we're going to lose whatever character we have here in Portland at this time. So why not go ahead and say, okay, we're sort of freezing the neighborhoods, we're building out, say, Lentz and the Gresham and everything that, like you pointed out. But what we'll do is we won't go ahead and promote increased density to the point we're destroying what we have currently. Has anyone thought about that or brought that up?
I'm going to let Michael handle this, but I'll just put my 2 cents in that where I live in a 100-year-old house that could easily be, it's a single-family home, it could easily be subdivided into a triplex. And as our children age, in fact, right now, we don't need that much space. So I believe that it should be pretty darn easy everywhere to subdivide into duplexes and triplexes in an existing home that keeps that 100-year-old home standing, and then maybe even add an ADU in the backyard. So I think there are gentle densification ways of understanding they're coming, but not tearing down our heritage in order to achieve that. But Michael's worked on these issues.
I'm glad you mentioned that. The general densification is something that our friend Patrick Condon, who's a professor at University of British Columbia, has talked about. And, you know, over a wider area, you can actually get more units through a strategy like that than you can when you're just doing a few iconic towers in the core. And the iconic towers look great and make people, or they think they look great, that's in the eye of the beholder, I guess. Or they at least, you know, people feel gratified, they pat themselves on the back for having accomplished these development projects. But the reality, as we've seen, is it's very tokenistic in terms of the number of units. But to get back to your core point, this is really what I was alluding to with Jane Jacobs' work, that she talks about how you can be smarter as a region in letting different areas develop and getting some of the accommodation there in a manageable way. You know, not totally stopping growth, because that will create repercussions of its own, but managing it in a way that's much smarter and not just letting it run wild.
Yeah, thank you.
There was a question in the front.
Just one other perspective on that. You know, I think much of what we're witnessing is the reverse of the suburban flight of the last 80 years. And that has to do with the desirability of rich and a rich urban experience that isn't dependent upon private transportation. And I think being able to create those conditions outside of the central city is going to be a task and a trick. It certainly can occur, but it's a little bit of a, you know, how do you begin that process and how do you get it to a point where there's a kind of critical mass that allows Aloha to have that same kind of environment that will attract the individuals who are currently coming to Portland and other urban areas by choice.
Well, the Rinko Station, a project that is an effort to create more of that urban, you know, Northwest 23rd area, and that was very much our model. I was involved in that project. I think it proves that it can be done, but it's very important to understand what the challenges are and how you have to overcome those.
Okay, she had a question.
Well, I'm a marginalized resident of a NIMBY neighborhood, and what can we do? Yeah, it's more.
So, can you elaborate on how you feel marginalized?
Well,
Are you saying that you feel treated as a NIMBY?
well, certainly called, name calls.
Oh, yeah.
In the Oregonian house.
Oh dear.
Not personally, but the neighborhood.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you're talking about Eastmoreland,
Eastmoreland.
then what most people don't realize is that that zone change that was put in place will actually incentivize the building of bigger monster houses and will probably result in smaller, more affordable houses being demolished. So this idea that it was zoning for the 1% was an unfortunate characterization, in my opinion.
Yes.
However, I do think that Eastmoreland should accept some density, increased density, and my suggestion would be ADUs, subdividing houses. They're big houses, and as people age in place, having the ability to subdivide those houses would save the neighborhood.
They're
And
not
we
all
have to
big
provide
houses.
for
They're not all big houses.
They're not all big
That's
houses.
true, you're right.
They're not all millionaires.
Then we have to
Got one in
provide
back first.
transportation demand management and so on.
So I'm new to this whole controversy, actually, it's my first exposure to it, and I'm a native Portlander. And one question I have is, it seems pretty clear based on all the information presented how corrupt the other side is in terms of what they're presenting, but I am wondering if they've had made any public comment or have a position that would counter anything that was said here and what that was.
The Portland way of doing business has been to take the people who stand to gain the most financially and put them on a stakeholder advisory committee. And we have been told by staff in several different bureaus that we will lose expertise if we don't use those people. For example, on the PDC and other places. My argument is, I know a bunch of people who know code and height limits and Florida area ratio, but they don't stand to gain financially. And so I think the argument that you will lose expertise is outrageous. But Portland has not been alerted to the fact, the average resident hasn't been alerted to the fact that this is how business is done every day, in every bureau, and throughout the entire state. And we have to fix that.
I'm also going to take the position that Portland, I think, has been quite well served by self-interest over the last 40 years. I think they have benefited from the presence of what I would generally consider a fairly enlightened development community that has done terrific things for this town over the course of my lifetime. However, I think that may have come to an end. And I think livability is the question that is primary in all of that. I think development has been has been the primary factor over that period of time. But I think the question of livability brings all of that into question. And I think this, simple dynamics of the distribution of wealth, et cetera, is changing characteristics as well.
I want to just add a quick comment also. I think as Steve said, we can acknowledge the role of the private sector, which is very, very important, and that there have been some good things done by the private sector in Portland. But the public sector needs to have a rigorous, robust presence in defending its own interests, and that is where I think we've really fallen down on the job. I just was rereading Jane Jacobs' great classic, The Economy of Cities. Here's what she wrote in 1968, talking about how some illicit entrepreneurial work can be done in the public sector. Quote, some city planning departments take to scouting out and processing profitable deals for favored real estate operators, and also to organizing and running fraudulent citizens organizations, quote unquote, to help overcome public opposition. I've never heard of that. Have you, Trey?
Wow. I think I lived through that.
Portland is not alone, unfortunately, but we certainly need to recognize the nature of this problem and deal with it.
Connie?
Yeah, my question is, has ONI, the Office of Neighborhood Involvement, ever informed all of the neighborhood associations and Neighbors West Northwest that according to Oregon Statute 65, any neighborhood membership, for example in Goose Hollow, the GGFL membership, we were able to petition, because of that statute, we were able to petition for a special meeting to overturn our neighborhood association's vote on Block 7, in which
When they were voting in their own financial interest, and we overthrew them.
we overthrew them. But I'm concerned because I have heard that Neighbors West Northwest is suggesting that neighborhood boards change their bylaws so that the bylaws read the final word with the decisions resides just with the neighborhood board. I don't know if that's true or not, and I'm wondering if you have any sense of that, and if so, that has major implications because it suggests that neighborhoods do not have a voice,
Right.
and it abuts state law. So we do have a voice, and neighborhoods across the city should know that they can indeed overturn a board's decision, because boards can be packed with developers,
Yes, they can.
and neighbors would not have a voice. So what's going on? Do you have any sense
So
of
the
that?
status
Thank you.
is that insurance companies are telling neighborhood association, the coalitions, that they cannot insure 5,000 people who live in Goose Hollow. And so therefore the decision-making body needs to be the decision-making body. So that took places like Linton that used to have town hall style votes, and the whole neighborhood would turn out, very active engagement, and it turned it into, the 6 people who had the biggest voice on the board. So in my opinion, that turned us into a less democratic process. I think that way that we could fix that would be that the neighborhood associations, and we need insurance. I feel like any minute now one of the developers is going to sue us. We need insurance as a board of directors. So the city used to cover that insurance, and I think the city could pick up that insurance again, and then therefore it would be less of an insurance industry issue and more of a democracy issue.
7 or 8 years ago, if we were at a meeting about the planning process, we would have heard the catchphrase 20-minute neighborhood. And it sounds like some of what you're describing as a remedy fits with that. I haven't heard that expression really since Sam Adams went east or went south or wherever it is. But I wonder whether that fits with the kind of remedy that you're describing.
Oh, totally. I totally support that. I mean, the ability to walk to a grocery. When I lived in Vancouver, everybody had a little fold-up granny cart, and we would all go to the grocery store and fill up our fold-up granny cart and take it back up the elevator to our mid-rise apartments or condos. I love 20 minutes.
So to what extent does the comprehensive plan include continued emphasis on 20-minute neighborhood development, and to what extent does it militate against that?
You want to take that? Why don't you introduce yourself so people know?
Yeah, hi, I'm Chris Smith. I'm a member of the Planning and Sustainability Commission. I voted for the West Quadrant Plan, so I was very interested in the height issues. I spent some time with Steve and others to learn about them, and in the end, I wasn't persuaded by all the arguments. I also have a history as an officer of NWDA, so I understand the neighborhood perspective. The comp plan supports a polycentric city, which in turn is part of a polycentric region. So we have a system of regional and town centers at the metro level. In Portland, we filled that out. We have our regional center. At Gateway, we have about 10 town centers. And in this comp plan, we add a layer of neighborhood centers. We want all of those to be places where you can walk to a grocery store. That's the 20-minute neighborhood concept. It is deeply ingrained in the comprehensive plan. I'll tell you how I look at this issue, and you can help educate me on how to reconcile our frames. I worry about Portland becoming San Francisco. As Steve said, what we're seeing nationally is a trend that people realize they want to live in compact, walkable neighborhoods. We have a bunch of those in Portland. The prices for those neighborhoods are going to get bid up incredibly. Part of our response to that is to try and make more of those compact, walkable neighborhoods. That's what that neighborhood center strategy is about. But it's also about putting more people in the places that are already compact and walkable, including the central city, including a corridor like Division. I see Heather's here. But we have pushback from the Richmond neighborhood that we're putting too much in Division. We're getting pushback here. We're putting too much in the central city. It has to go somewhere, and if it doesn't, you're going to have to make $1 million a year to live in Portland, and I don't want to see that. So I'm trying to figure out where we put those people.
Well, I would just, again, want to remind, reassert that there's a difference between density and height. And I think a lot of the comments that I was making, at least towards in the segment that I was doing, it's really about building heights policy and its impacts as pretty much distinct from densities. So I think when you're talking about putting more in Division and more in the central city, more northwest, I don't think any of these neighborhoods or areas are necessarily arguing about density, but the manner in which density is achieved is a big issue. In northwest central area, it's a question of, does achieving that density necessitate building buildings that are tall and expensive and have potentially a detrimental effect on the public sector?
There's an old joke, you probably all heard it, about the guy looking for his keys under the light, and passerby asks him what he's looking for. He says, I lost my keys over there in the dark. And he says, what are you doing over here under the lamp? And he says, well, there's the lamp here, I can see. He's looking in the wrong place. So I think as a region, we are looking in the wrong place to deal with this. I appreciate the comments. I absolutely agree with them. I served for Metro on the regional, the Sustainable Centers and Corridors report a couple of years ago about how we actually do achieve the 2040 growth concept. And I think, as I alluded to, Jane Jacobs had a lot to do with that thinking, and a lot of other people who have been thinking about how do we make a polycentric city. But I don't think we're really facing up as a region, and particularly as a city, to what it's gonna take to do that in a way that is actually, getting the real, numbers that we can get. We're focusing on these tokenistic places that already have 20 units to the acre, and we're trying to take them to 25 or 30 units to the acre, and we're jamming it in, and not doing a very good, very sensitive job of doing that. And this is all for a very small amount of the total numbers that we need. That was the case that I was trying to explain. It's a little hard to follow, but I've tried to lay that out, that there's enormous numbers of units that we can get if we make more walkable places, more places where people don't need to drive everywhere, and where you make those places better. If we just focus on the low-hanging fruit of these existing places, we're really missing. We're like the guy looking for his keys under the car.
There's a question over.
Can I make one more comment on the 20-minute neighborhood concept? I think Chris is right that both the update of the comprehensive plan and the central city plan are fundamentally based on that concept. But I think the hitch, or hitches, have been, and we've observed this even over the last 8 years, is being able to get that critical alignment between all of the institutional infrastructure, and in particular schools. I mean, I hate to say it, but I would characterize Portland Public Schools as not knowingly pulling in the opposite direction, but making decisions over the last period of 8 years that are not in coordination with planning goals.
Question or comment?
Hi, my name is Heather Machado. I'm a neighborhood representative for the Richmond Neighborhood Association. And for the last 2 years, I've been leading a coalition of 7 different neighborhood organizations to respond to the recent redevelopment of Division without very much public process or input in this major redevelopment of the neighborhood. I'm also an urban planner, worked in local government on long-range planning and redevelopment issues, and I've been doing this for about 17 years, working on sustainable design and policy. So I know a little bit about this and have led these kind of processes, and so we have been trying to respond to this in a way, and it's very interesting that you talk about where, how do we not be perceived as NIMBYs when we're advocating for compact, well-designed urban infill? So, we are looking at the density as the sort of golden, sort of trophy, and really it's a strategy. The goal is livable, walkable neighborhoods that are vibrant and serve the people that live there with the right kind of resources. So, we shouldn't just be the neighborhood division design initiative. We've really been a neighborhood design initiative. So we started out trying to create design guidelines, but have been coming up with recommendations citywide and kind of looking at what those patterns of our city are. How do we reflect, what is special about our neighborhoods, and how can we grow in a way that is sensitive? So I love what you talked about, Michael, about sort of looking in where the light is, not necessarily where we really need to be looking. And so I guess part of my question would be, how have you perhaps been providing some of this expertise on the long-range comprehensive plan? Because we're very concerned that the growth scenarios analysis is fundamentally flawed and incomplete, because it has not been looking at how do we incentivize development with less impact. And so we're not necessarily differentiating. If we're focusing on centers and corridors approach, which is a very great strategy, I highly recommend it, we are not necessarily differentiating between narrow streets and wide streets, which have very different solar impacts, especially the east-west streets versus the north-south streets. We are not making those distinctions. And we are also building a little too tall without the right urban form issues. We're building a little too tall for some of these narrow streets. And so, we also are not necessarily thinking about what you suggested about how we increase supply, which is the key factor, right? If you're going to build a new development project, it's going to take 3 years to provide that.
The most sustainable building is the one that's already built.
And that's actually what I was going to mention, that there are some great studies out there. Older, Smaller, Better by the Preservation Green Lab is a fantastic study that talks about the value of a variety of diversity of vintages, and also the other study, which is the greenest building, quantifying the value of existing building reuse, talks about that if Portland were to, over the next 10 years, instead of destroying and demolishing the buildings that they are likely to do, the residential commercials, we would offset 230,000 cubic metric tons of carbon, which is 15% of our county's climate goals. So we are not necessarily providing the right tools for keeping those character-defining buildings, those buildings that provide our identity and sense of place. We are rebuilding the areas that are already working.
Right.
We are not necessarily building, what is that question? We're building the areas that need it most, not in the ones that are already working. And so right now, we're not building in the areas that need it most. So we don't have a lot of transit on our north-south corridors. We could be building those corridors out and providing enough density to then provide the transit we need. There are a lot of other neighborhoods that want to be 20-minute neighborhoods, but right now we're actually displacing a lot of the people that provide the stability to our neighborhood, because the teachers and the healthcare workers that live around Division, they can't afford to live in our neighborhood anymore. The people that live there can't afford to go to the restaurant. So we've gentrified in 2 years. We're a laboratory for what we're proposing for the rest of the city. I'm not saying density's bad. I think density is great. But there's good density and bad density. I want to turn people on to density. I don't want to turn people off of density because we're designing it poorly and we're not paying attention to context.
You need to run for office.
I can take a response because I think what you said is great, and I completely agree. But I think as a person who does public involvement in my own career and a lot of places all over, this is the conversation that I think we need to shift to, away from this. You're a NIMBY, oh no, you're destroying my neighborhood. Let's have a win-win conversation. Let's try to understand how we can actually achieve our goals with an evidence-based approach instead of this kind of, I characterize it, field of dreams thinking, or greenwashing thinking that is great for people like me who do planning and architecture and so on. Great for the developers, great for the city planners, but what are we doing to the city, So I think we really desperately need to move in that direction.
Bill, you have a comment?
Yeah, I do. I first of all, really applaud the dialogue tonight. Panel's terrific, questions are terrific. I'm concerned about the voices in the wilderness, and that is trying to get to the city agencies. I'm nice to see planning represented here tonight. I've been at a number of meetings where nobody from planning even shows up. And it's that connection that we need that I don't think we're getting. My question is this: who are our champions right now in City Hall?
I'm pleased to say that Ted Wheeler has at least supported many of the things that we've, that we've been talking about tonight. And of course, the jury is out whether he will actually put those in place, but he certainly said that he wants to make major changes.
So when the vote on the West Quadrant plan happened, and we packed it City Hall with our testimony, we were thoughtful. We know the law. We studied this backwards and forwards. We weren't hot-headed. We weren't NIMBYs. We were talking from facts. And the only person who listened to us was Amanda Fritz, and she ripped up the other commissioners and said, "You just gave giveaways to the developers who are your donors." And that's precisely what happened, and I really am thrilled. Amanda doesn't always vote the way I think she should vote, but she votes the closest to what I think should be voted. I think we need to get new people in office who are not beholden to the developer class.
I guess this may be a naive question, but what is being done about development? We talk about transit corridors. The MAX runs out to Gateway, and MAX was, what are we doing about these transit corridors? And why are we, as you say, so focused on this 5% core?
Right. Well, that's, again, the 2040 growth concept is all about getting more going on in those corridors, not only in the core, but all over the region. And I mentioned Orinco Station, where I was involved in sort of the heavy lifting to see how that is, has to be implemented in an outer area. And then I've been, very active in trying to share those lessons, working with Metro and others. And I think, let's just say it's a work in progress, and I don't think we've made nearly enough progress on not only the tools and strategies that we need but the recognition that this is the right way to approach the problem. You're still hearing the same old canards and myths, as Steve talked about, the idea that, we just focus on the core and we build up the Ed Glazer thing. So I think we as citizens have to really speak up and change the conversation.
There's a comment at the back of the room.
Heather, my name is Patrick. First of all, I want to say thank you for being here, because I've been saying similar things to my friends and everybody, even people that work for the city, and they say, but we need to do density, we got to save farms, and it's just like they're doing it all wrong. This approach is illogical. I mean, what you said is kind of illogical, that because Belmont Street and Hawthorne are expensive places, we should tear them down and build them as beige places that some other people can maybe afford. I mean, I know I will never be able to afford Belmont Street, but I do not want it to go. It's one of my favorite places in the city. It's being totally, it's about to be torn down, parts of it, and once one of those buildings goes, they're gonna all start going. And 6,000 people did a change.org petition, and yet the city says, well, there's nothing we can do. So it's like, we're all frustrated. How do we get people to really understand what's really going on, and to go against this density dogma, is what I call it, that isn't the best way to do it.
And the thing is, we move into neighborhoods that are very dense. We like density. So we're not the people saying, oh, we shouldn't have an urban growth boundary. We're not those people. And that there's an idea that we are anti-density by simply saying what we said here tonight, and we're not. So there's a way. So, for example, if every single-family house in this city was able to subdivide into a duplex or triplex with almost no cost or trouble with the zone change or anything, and then add an ADU in the back, you've got massive density. You just add it in the most gentle way that preserves our current housing stock. So there are other ways, and we're just trying to, in the good academic tradition of challenging and asking questions, we're trying to ask those questions.
Back here we have one.
I think that there's a piece of this that overlaps between building the businesses up the walkable neighborhoods and our residential issues. And that is that when you focus on these corridors with density, you draw all of the energy out of the other neighborhoods. So now they have to take buses to get to these corridors, and that's not walkable. Whereas, as you've mentioned, we have had working patterns in the past where there was a little corner grocery store, the beauty parlor down the street, places that we could get to that were walkable, and we're not reinforcing that now. And those can happen in houses that can be converted, as we see so many old ones now where they built the business right out front. And a huge piece of what's going on when this happens is that we are not only eliminating our affordable housing, we are eliminating all of our entrepreneurs that can't afford to have a landlord to start out. And I will tell you, just from a personal example, with a partner, I started a business in an old storefront building with a condemnation notice posted. And the building cost $1,000 in 1975 about. And that building then spawned Rejuvenation, which was Rejuvenation House Parts at that time, which was sold, it had sold Micro a long time ago, but it was sold to Williams-Sonoma for many, many millions of dollars, but we couldn't have afforded to do that without having a rundown little building where we could start without the oppression of having a landlord in some out-of-state investor building where all we have is businesses on the street. So the whole idea of going in and tearing out old buildings affects all of our economy, all of our problems in this issue. We have to say, no, we're not going to wipe these out. We are going to support the old tried and true methods that we've always had.
Amen.
Response to that, I think that's a very important point that I talked about the centers and corridors, the 2040 growth concept as being a move in the right direction, but I don't think we're there. I think it's not fine-grained enough. It doesn't allow enough flexibility for the kinds of things that you're talking about. and doesn't allow, you know, I mean, if you look at the great urban form of the central city that developed in the streetcar era, everything is about a quarter mile apart or less, and the centers and quarters are in some cases way bigger than that. So I think we do need to talk about that as well, and not just take that as a, you know, final stage of document.
I'm so grateful for what I learned tonight, but I want to know what I can do. What can I do?
Well, number one, I won't personally want your pressure on every elected that you have any interaction with, state, county, city, to change our state ethics laws. Number two, the Central City 2035 plan comes out, the next draft of it comes out June 20th. It's going to be a hard slog. It's going to be over 1,000 pages. But we citizen activists have to read those, and we have to get in there, and we have to advocate, because our planning bureau is not planning for our residents. Number three, hopefully the Central City 2035 plan will be held over to the next mayor. It seems likely that it's going to be. So then we will put pressure on the next mayor and on every city council person, so that they understand that we are reasonable, calm, educated people who've done our homework. We are not NIMBYs, we are pro-density, and we are against this. So that's what we have to do, and it's hard work. You've got to organize your neighborhood. I mean, I tell my neighborhood, I feel like we need to have a land use attorney, because I'm reading 1,000 pages every 2 months and trying to figure out how we've been screwed over. And I have a PhD in English. So I'm not trained as a land use attorney, and it is not a fair thing to be put through. But until we can challenge this in the courts, and until we can do that, we have to make sure our electeds understand that everyday average people who love density are against this.
And I would add to that, Tracy, get involved in your neighborhood organization. Tracy has done a brilliant job. She grabbed me by the scruff of the neck to get involved with Goose Hollow, and I think we all need to recognize how important our neighborhood association structure is in this city, and how much we need to safeguard it and make sure that it actually has an effective voice. Because as Tracy alluded to briefly, and many of you know, that system is getting dismantled. It's getting marginalized. People are creating phony pseudo-organizations to be able to marginalize residents. So it's very important for us all to get involved, become activists, be the sort of the Jane Jacobs spirit. She was also very much an activist as well as a very fine writer, and we should all follow in those footsteps.
Alan?
I just wanted to respond to it. I think the reason I am interested in Building Heights policy is because it has a lot of effects on the urban ecosystem, but certainly one of the effects it has on it is that it makes the potential for building tall buildings affect the values in, of not only that parcel, but the parcel next to it, the parcel next to that, which affects exactly what was being referred to earlier, the ability of our city to incubate the commercial and economic vitality, as it were. It really is our future. So I think this is, incredibly important. And again, I'm tending to look at it through the lens of this, single aspect of urban policy, building heights. When you ask what can you do, I think our hope is to be able to influence and mitigate some amount of the bias that I believe is present and has been written into the draft proposals for the Central City Plan and the Comprehensive Plan as they are written right now. And those, again, will guide the next generation's decision-making relative to all of these issues. So I think what can we all do is to work at providing a countering influence on that process of policy formulation. And that is getting in there and politics and coming to meetings like this and trying to, read that 1,000 pages in your spare time. Or talk to somebody that has. So I choose to.
Come to an event like this one.
Yeah. But basically it's getting in there and putting your shoulder into it, I mean, presumably we've got the vehicle for affecting policy formulation and decision making. But we need to have the muscle and desire to do it.
Okay, 2 more questions, it's getting late, sorry. Go ahead, Alan.
Yeah, about 25 or 30 years ago, I may have been in this very room, and there was a discussion about, does development pay its own way? Do the property taxes or whatever cover for future growth or don't they? And I believe what came out of that was things like system development charges, which now we have to take off because they make things unaffordable. But I've lost track of that discussion. Is that still a relevant issue? Is it too simplistic? Have we gone beyond our... Why don't we talk about this anymore?
She wants to answer.
I'll just respond to that really quickly. That's a great question, and I think, there are, the economists talk about externality costs, the long-term impact to people who aren't part of the transaction, and that includes neighbors, that includes citizens, and includes future generations if you're depleting resources, and taxpayers if you're creating costs that they're going to have to bear. And I think there's a whole huge set of issues that really are very poorly examined around that topic, and I think we really should be much more aggressive about it, so thanks for raising it.
Absolutely, I'm so glad that you did, because, there's a proposal right now for a low-rise, preservation of low-rise vintage commercial areas. It's unfortunately titled as, support for low-rise commercial. It doesn't really talk about the vintage areas. These are the sort of small core areas that have 400 feet of sort of continuous commercial, and they're older, smaller, better buildings ideally. And, they proposed to lower the building heights, which was maybe well-intentioned but poorly implemented. And so I think an alternative that might work better would be, so instead of taking something away from people, which no one wants, to actually incentivize people to take care and improve those buildings. So if you could waive the system development charges for buildings that are adaptively being reused, or maybe adding density above, which would upgrade that building stock, still allow density, but provide that additional funding for people to take care of those buildings that provide the identity and character of places, that would be one thing. The other thing is, my very first task as a young urban planner, 17 years ago, was to work on a beneficial projects system development charge waiver. And so we waived system development charges for projects that were affordable housing, that were senior housing, or daycare. And so there might be some other creative options that we could use to, how do we incentivize the kind of development that we really want to see, the things that we need but we're having a hard time building. So, those are a couple ideas for ways that we can do that.
For the sake of time, I saw 2 hands at the back. Let's just get your
Let me just, a quick comment, because I'm so glad you raised that issue, because I was talking about the cost of development, and I think we have to talk about the benefits of development, how to transfer economic value from those projects that have a cost, who should pay their fair share of cost, to those projects that are actually going to benefit us all, and that therefore that makes them much more easier to do and more likely to occur for our community, and that's an incredibly important point. Thanks for raising it.
Thank you very much for organizing this. It's been very interesting, especially as a relative newcomer to Portland. A small technical question that occurred to me. New York grew up because it had bedrock and it could go high, and I haven't heard anyone in reading or anything else address the physical world of Portland, the biology, the wind pattern, the geology. It seems like a really stupid place to build high-rises.
And then at the very back, there's
one more question.
That's true, please.
There are a number of issues. I didn't get all the research citations. Dubai is a terrible place to build high-rises because of the sun and so on.
I've been attending the mixed-use zoning hearings the last year and a half that's been going on. And at the end result of all this year-and-a-half process by the city, they have produced a document that sent this to the Planning Commission. And in many ways, they have listed the neighborhoods, not always, but in many ways, they have produced a document that has reflected our interaction with them. Now, I went to the Planning Commission hearing on the mixed-use project, and I heard so much public testimony, one after the other, of people urging the Planning Commission to not adopt the cities, to reject it and adopt much higher zoning, and much higher height limits, and much higher density on the neighborhood corridors. And I don't know where these people came from. They were very well organized. And I think if you do want to make some impact, when it does come to testifying before the city council, which will be in the end of the summer, come to that and testify. And we need some counterbalance to this organized effort to drastically up some from what even the city is proposing.
So we saw that exact thing when we were testifying for the West Quadrant plan. We saw a very organized group of property owners who hope to develop their properties in Goose Hollow send out pretty much every warm body they could find and say exactly that. That is certainly not what we hear in our monthly neighborhood association meetings. So our problem is, a lot of those people are very well paid to go to these meetings and to pay attention to 1,000 pages of code. We are just neighborhood volunteers, and we get out organized on some of these things. I can tell you, I feel like we're doing a great job representing the 5,000 residents of Goose Hollow. We are not making the 2 or 3 developers rich as they would like to be made rich. So how do I, as the president of the neighborhood association, and how do our core, many of whom are here tonight, how do we rally our group? And we even give them prepared statements to make if they don't want to write their own statements, so that we are trying to out-organize them. But we still, I think they kicked our butts last time. And I saw people I've never seen in a neighborhood situation ever at City Council.
I think what you raise is there are 2 different issues. The regulatory capture, they call it, the idea that developers who have a self-interest figure out how to game the system and get what they want and change the conversation around that. But there's also what I might call, and we've talked about this a little bit internally in preparing for tonight, the Kool-Aid, the planner's Kool-Aid that people have been drinking in Portland. That, this is sustainability, this is the future, we're putting on our big boy clothes, all this sort of, group thing, frankly, to put it bluntly. And I include myself in the self-criticism of the planning and design communities. We get isolated, we get into our silos, and we start to think some pretty weird, unfounded thoughts.
And I thought, there's 2 hands.
We have to pretty soon vacate.
Yes, okay.
We have it till 7:30, it's now 7:35, and we're all going to turn to dust. I want to thank everyone who came tonight. I want to thank our planners.